Hi, and welcome to the FDA update. My name is Barbara Wright. I'm the foreign cadre supervisor for the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations in the Office of Regulatory Affairs at FDA. I've been serving in this position since 2018 when we stood up a foreign cadre, and as such, I'm responsible for our international inspection programs covering GCP, GLP, and pharmacovigilance inspections. So I've been asked to give you an FDA update today, and I thought you might be interested in the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations accomplishments of late, some of the changes in field operations, the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the industry we regulate, and our oversight approaches, some inspectional trends that we notice in the industry, and I'd like to close out with just a recap of some of the recent guidance documents on FDA's website. So here we go. So I'll say, first of all, for these DIYers out there, if you like to do it yourself, at any time you'd like to get some FDA updates, it's a great place to start. Shortcut is www.fda.gov/GCP. That's our landing page for all things bioresearch monitoring. There's an oversight of our responsibility and role in clinical research, as well as links to recent guidance documents, which you can see on the right-hand side of this webpage. On the left-hand column, we've got bioresearch monitoring inspection metrics. We've got the latest initiatives and links to some of the most recent and most significant guidance that's available to industry. So it's a great place to start if ever you want to see what's the latest in FDA publications or initiatives. So we'll start there. If you click into the accomplishments or the BIMO metrics webpage, one of the slides that you'll get provides you with an oversight of all of our accomplishments across the different inspection types. And as you can see from this slide, which I've pulled from that web page, is our numbers in fiscal year 2021 were significantly impacted by the pandemic. But many of our inspection trends are consistent from year to year, even with the pandemic. So just to kind of recap the way this is structured, the center issuing the assignments to our investigators, listed in that far left column, that's our biologics, drugs, medical devices, foods, tobacco, and veterinary medicine centers. This covers the period of October 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. And we've got, going from left to right, clinical investigator inspections, ethics committees or IRB, institutional review board inspections, sponsors and CROs are reported collectively. Sponsor investigators are next. We have non-clinical laboratories or GLP inspections, good laboratory practice inspections. We do a lot of bioanalytical and bioequivalence inspections. We do the post-marketing adverse drug experience or pharmacovigilance inspections, and REMS or risk evaluation and mitigation strategies for drug products. So looking at this overall, our total accomplishments for that 1 year period were 611 inspections. That's domestic and foreign. And the bulk of those are in the clinical investigators of pharmaceutical products, research products. Just kind of an overview of the scope of our inspections. So how have things changed over the last couple of years? We've been in the pandemic for a while, and if you recall, around March of 2020, we did the government suspended or placed into effect some certain travel restrictions, and we suspended our routine surveillance inspections and went forward with mission critical operations. But one of the biggest changes in field operations was, how do we address assessing industry when we can't be there, when we can't get to the site? Maybe the country has an extended quarantine upon entry, or they're not allowing foreign visitors, especially before the vaccines became available. Our ability to visit on site, even for mission critical inspections, was somewhat limited. So the agency looked at our options and deployed what we call remote regulatory assessments as an alternative to inspection. It's not equivalent to an on-site inspection, but it is a means to access data remotely to provide some confidence in the reliability of clinical research data that's submitted in marketing applications. So it allowed us to continue to review study data and provide some information to the review divisions during the pandemic. Looking at these numbers from fiscal years 20 and 21, you can see that a lot of the inspections that were done, not inspections, I'm sorry, remote regulatory assessments that were done were focused on the bioavailability and bioequivalence assessments. Those types of studies lend themselves a little better to a remote review of data. But we did conduct clinical investigator inspections, good laboratory practice assessments, post-marketing adverse drug experience assessments, REMS assessments, and some sponsor and clinical research organization assessments over the years. So what are remote regulatory assessments? How does that work? How does that serve as an alternative to an on-site inspection? Well, they're voluntary, they're remote, and they're interactive. We've been focused on sponsors, clinical investigators, and CROs primarily. The selection of sites for remote regulatory assessment is based on the same type of criteria that we use to select sites for inspection, because the overall goals of a remote regulatory assessment are the same as our overall goals for on-site inspections. We want to assure that human subjects have been protected, and we want to build confidence in the reliability and accuracy of the data that's been submitted to the agency in support of a marketing application. So to execute these remote regulatory assessments, we have to start with a feasibility assessment. Not every type of operation is going to lend itself well to a remote assessment. Our ability to access key documents remotely, including any legal, ethical, or logistical challenges, are factors that we have to consider. So we reach out to the firm, request a video conference, and talk through the logistics of what data can be shared, what would the means be for sharing that data, what would be the limitations to sharing that data. Domestically, it's a little bit easier than in the international arena, where we have some additional challenges of time zones and foreign languages that need to be translated, as well as some technology compatibility or bandwidth issues. So we start with that feasibility call. If it looks like the operation is a good candidate for an RRA, the firm agrees to facilitate the RRA, then we conduct a series of video conferences with shared documents and some interviews of study staff. We also, outside of the video chats and conferences, we also will share documents through read-only access to data systems, or through redacted document uploads to an FDA remote file sharing account. We've been using box.com of late, but that can change, and we can consider a variety of platforms for sharing documents. But we ask that patient privacy information be redacted from records before they're exchanged, allowing us to trace the record to the study subject that it's attributed to, but to still provide some personal protection of privacy information. So that sometimes is a challenging task, particularly because if you've got a large study with a lot of subjects, a lot of data points, and a lot of privacy information has to be purged, it can be a very challenging approach. So understanding that it places a burden on the sites to facilitate a remote assessment of data in this way. These RRAs are structured in an iterative process. So we'll make an initial contact with the site. We'll ask for a first batch of records, conduct some interviews to get an overview of how the study was conducted. And then our investigators will review those records, formulate any questions, decide where they might need to conduct some interviews to get a better understanding of the operation of the firm, And then then they'll request another video conference where they will share those concerns or questions, get some resolution on that, and then they'll ask for the next batch of data. And through this process, we're able to narrow the focus of our request to the data that is of greatest interest in the review. And so that way, in the first study subject in a clinical research trial at a clinical investigator site, we may ask for a bulk of the subject records. But after reviewing the first subject, our investigators may decide, well, the key documents that I need are, and they can come up with a short list of what needs to be redacted and provided in that next meeting, in that next batch of records. So it is an effort to try to limit the burden of these RRAs and to keep our focus, on the most critical data. So the challenges, I mentioned a few of them already, are related to informed consent, sometimes in data privacy limitations. We have had some ethics committees request that we reconsent subjects because the risk equation for privacy changes if you're sharing data remotely. And so we've been asked to allow the sites time to reconsent subjects. We've experienced technology issues, incompatible platforms or firewalls that provide some problems. Internet connections and bandwidth issues sometimes can slow the exchange of data. And as I already mentioned, for international sites, we do have time zone differences and foreign language translation challenges sometimes. But even then, looking at the height of the pandemic, from March 15th of 2020 through March of 2022, that 2-year period of time, even with all of our surveillance activities kind of placed on hold and moving forward only with what the centers and ORA believe were the mission critical international assignments, we still conducted a number of in-person inspections outside of the country and remote regulatory assessments of foreign firms in that 2-year period of time. Total for ORA and our colleagues in the foreign offices in the Bioresearch Monitoring Program, we conducted 1,146 operations in this window of time. So that's domestic and foreign inspections, remote regulatory assessments, all to keep life-saving medical products moving forward in the review process. So a lot of attention being paid on our responses to the pandemic, but it's all important to know that there are other therapeutic areas that need our attention at the same time. And so the agency continued to move forward. Our investigators continued to travel, accommodating any special request for the on-site inspections during that period of time, but we continued to move forward. Quick check-in at the CTAP dashboard on FDA's website shows the scope of the agency's response to the pandemic with product reviews that go beyond the well-publicized vaccines. There are a lot of therapeutics that have been worked on to respond to COVID-19. And so this is a March 31st snapshot of the CTAP dashboard and the scope and scale of the agency's reviews and activities in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So how has the pandemic changed the work that we do in the industry that we regulate? Well, talked a little bit about it already. So our on-site inspections, ever since the beginning, we've adjusted our approach to on-site inspections. We've encouraged sites to work with us on risk mitigation strategies. And we've reached out, we pre-announce our inspections and we ask about local government and institutional requirements for on-site visits. And we accommodate those requests. So that has meant compliance with vaccination procedures, COVID testing, masking, social distancing. We've encouraged teleconferencing for interviews of some study staff. We encourage modifications to on-site observations. So we don't need to be in patient care areas during the day when patients and the majority of the study staff and clinical staff are present. then we'll ask to review the facility and the equipment used for the trial after hours or at the end of the day, reduce the exposure both to the subjects, to the research staff, and to our investigators in the field. We have encouraged that records be moved to meeting spaces outside of patient care and heavily staffed areas, also an effort to promote social distancing and to reduce the risk to all parties involved. So we've been working with those risk mitigation strategies over the last couple of years. The next question that comes to mind for most people is really what are FDA's expectations of research during the pandemic? Innovative medical products need to continue to be developed. We expect challenges. We expect disruptions. We expect protocol deviations. We expect staff and subjects not to be able to reach the site. We expect supply chains to be disrupted. We expect subjects to drop out of studies. We expect that monitors may not be able to get on site or fully monitor remotely because of privacy restrictions. We expect that there'll be third-party vendors that weren't planned for at the beginning of the trial, just as a means to keep the study moving forward, to keep those safety assessments being performed. If you've got safety labs and the subject can't get to the central research site that was initially planned in the study, maybe you're using a regional or local lab that's easier for the subject to get to, so you can continue to get that safety monitoring data. We expect these disruptions in a pandemic, in a natural disaster, anytime life happens. The question is whether the disruptions cause the data gathered to be unfit for use in supporting a marketing decision. And that largely depends on how those disruptions were handled and documented and assessed for their impact. So, as the regulatory agency responsible for oversight of human subject protection, we have to emphasize that study subject safety is paramount. Clinicians need to determine if it's in the best interest of the study subject to continue, either on a study or with interventions with dosing. It's important for the clinician to decide whether additional assessments are necessary or whether removal from a trial is the appropriate course of action for any given subject on a trial. We expect the ethics committee to be informed of changes, but it's important to remember that they're not required to approve changes that are taken or actions that are taken to protect the life and safety of study subjects. Those can be reported after the activity takes place. But significant changes as the studies move forward should be reported to the ethics committees, to the IRBs. They may require some reconsenting of subjects. For the example I mentioned earlier, the use of remote tools for monitoring or for FDA inspection, that changes the privacy equation. And some IRBs may want subjects to be reconsented to allow remote record access. So it's important to keep these things in mind and to make the decision that protects the subject and the data to the extent that the second is possible. For any study that's submitted as evidence in support of a marketing application, we expect the data to meet minimum standards for reliability. We have to be able to reconstruct the study and verify the conclusions and the data points submitted to the agency are accurate and complete. So deviations, violations, exceptions, whatever you want to call a failure to follow the investigational plan, it's going to occur on every study. Life happens. We expect that. The question, again, it goes back to the impact on our ability to draw conclusions from the data set. Sites for every study, whether we're in a pandemic or any other emergency situation or just in the normal course of duty, sites have an obligation to look at a protocol before they begin the research and determine where are the risks in the execution of that protocol. Are there too many tasks for the current level of staffing? Are those tasks too close together? Is the dosing complicated? Is the dose preparation complicated? Anything that presents a risk to the accuracy of the data as well as to the subject's safety, those are risks that it's important to look at. How can they be managed? Is it through adequate training? Is it through staffing? Or is it through investigator oversight? So these are our expectations in the pandemic, but they're also our expectations in the normal course of business. And when we talk about can the data be used, We're talking about data gathered through whatever means, alternative methods or the original plan, has to meet the accuracy and reliability standards. The documentation has to be accurate, legible, contemporaneous, original, and attributable. Electronic data needs to be preserved and accessible with all the metadata, audit trails, and transmission details. Data, including third-party data, has to be verifiable as an original or a certified copy. So next, I'd like to move on to some of the trends that we've been seeing in inspections over the last couple of years, and they're not necessarily related to the pandemic. So pivoting away from the pandemic for a minute, we are seeing an increased use of electronic systems to capture data for randomized controlled trials, such as the examples on this slide: trial master files, electronic medical records, EMRs, training platforms, communications, case report forms, consenting. They're all being captured using electronic data systems now. Paper source documents are still used, and paper offers benefits over electronic systems in some situations. Electronic systems are a little more complicated. Any one of us could be handed a piece of paper and we know what to do with it. We understand how to run it. But most of us can't sit down and write code for software. So they can be a little bit more nuanced when setting up electronic data systems in your clinical research. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of those challenges and offer some points for you to consider. So starting out, if you're a sponsor, a clinical research organization, a site management organization, or a sponsor investigator, when you're setting up a clinical trial, the first question in selecting a data capture system is, and I'm going to use a homeowner analogy, am I going to buy, build, or rent? Am I going to try to write this software? Am I going to buy something off the shelf? Am I going to hire a contractor who's going to design an electronic data system that works for me? Whatever they come up with, you have to keep in mind, this becomes your home sweet home for your research data. You need a system that can accurately and completely collect and preserve the study data for the duration of the record retention period. It has to be protected against changes and loss. And remember, under the regulations, you own that data, not the vendor who's providing the software. So the sponsor investigator, the CRO, you have an obligation to assure that the system that captures like subject case histories or IP records or financial data, those systems need to be secure. They need to meet the requirements of 21 CFR Part 11. You need to have access to that data for the full retention period. So, I keep going back to our Alcoa principles. The data has to be attributable. So we need to know who, what, when. It has to be legible. It has to be contemporaneous. It has to be original, accurate, and complete. When there are changes to the data, those changes have to be captured. So, in some cases we see like a spreadsheet. If I use a spreadsheet as an example here, the average spreadsheet is not going to give you an accurate record of who completed it and when. It's typically not going to be protected against changes. It's typically not going to provide some kind of audit trail that records all of the changes. What was the original entry? What was the modified entry? What was the reason for the change? So all of these considerations need to be taken in when you're deciding on is the electronic system you're looking at going to meet your intended use. So, and then go back to the homeownership analogy. How do you insure your property and that being the integrity of your data? Have you thoroughly evaluated the system that you're looking at to make sure that it meets all the data capture, control, and retention requirements? In other areas of FDA regulation, we use an acronym called HACCP, and it refers to Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. And I think it's a great shorthand for any audit, whether it's a self-audit or an FDA audit. The first step is always to look at the system in its totality and figure out what are the risks. What is that? That's my hazard analysis. What are the risks? The risks to subject safety, the risk to data integrity. How am I going to control those risks? What are my critical control points going to be? And those controls may be training. They may be a method to perform quality control checks on the data. And it may be direct oversight of employees. One of the things that I've seen over the course of my career is that you can give three different people the same form, and you may get three totally different approaches to filling it out. And I'll just oversimplify, but if you have a clinical form that says pulse, and in parentheses 50 to 100, and then a blank space, you may have one employee who takes a pulse. It's within that range, check the box. You may have another employee that takes the pulse, 70 beats per minute. And you have a third employee who comes along, checks the pulse, and puts WNL in the box within normal limits. Are these all equally valid? Kind of depends on the intended use. And so my point being is that sometimes it takes direct observation of employees to know how are they interpreting the system requirements and how are they using the system in real time. So oversight is a key step in controlling risk to your subjects and data during the study. Some questions to consider, it's if you go back to our homeowners analogy, does your home have video cameras? Do they record the and all routes of entry and egress on a time loop that's long enough to be useful? Or does it overwrite before you come home on vacation and see what happened? Is your hardware and your structure sound? So do you have an adequate security and reliable audit trail? Do you have limited access? Is it recorded? Does it meet all of your intended uses for that data capture and retention? Just one example, we're talking about electronic medical records. This is one area we're seeing increasing use over time in clinical research. And EMRs can be a great tool, but there are important things to remember. So, if you've looked at your own personal electronic medical record, you might ask the question, are my medications current dose? Are they current and reported in the proper dose and frequency? Does the physician's assessment in there, does it list systems that weren't covered at that physical? Are they carrying the last observation forward from the previous study visits? So EMRs can have a number of people that have broad access. So a number of people can access and edit the data in there, add data in there, and not all of those people are going to recognize that you're using this data for clinical research, and that in some cases it must be painstakingly accurate and complete. And so, the question that you have to ask is, if you're going to use EMR data on a study, are you going to have enough control over the data to be able to use it, or what quality measures will you take to assess the accuracy and completeness of the data that you extract from that system? That electronic medical records as well as research databases generally should not have pre-populated fields or last observations carried forward automatically, default answers, or standard scripts in there. We like to see original data recorded at each data point in the clinical research study. It's just something to think about there. Moving on to other areas where we're seeing developing trends in clinical research is the expanded use of digital health technology. So we're starting to see more wearable devices, more tablets to capture patient-reported outcome data, even phone apps. So phone apps could be used for dosing. They could be used for safety data, adverse event data. They could be used for efficacy assessments if the patient reported outcomes are a key measure in capturing efficacy and safety data endpoints on the trial. So that's kind of a new area that we're seeing, and it's important for sponsors and investigators to think about, is this technology that we're looking at using in the study, is it fit for the use that we have in mind? Do we have access to enough information about how these devices were verified or validated, so that we know that the data coming from them is reliable? And has there been some user compatibility testing? Because operator error, I'll be the first to admit that when it comes to computers, sometimes it's the operator error that fouls up the data. Guilty of that as much as anyone. And so how how fit is it for the patient population that you're going to roll it out to? Are these young tech-savvy subjects in a study, or are we dealing with elderly patients who are less inclined to be familiar with technology and comfortable with it? So the design and the durability of devices that might be used in a trial is important to assess, and the ability to access that data throughout the record retention period, both for the sponsor and for any regulators that need to go in and be able to reconstruct the data in order to use it to support a marketing application. So key questions to answer that there in the use of digital health technologies. Which brings me to the next subject is third-party vendors, or as I say, contractors, their subcontractors, and the subcontractors of subcontractors of subcontractors. So we see continued use of third parties in clinical research to execute protocols. They can be involved in the handling of investigational products, site selection, monitoring, data management, or staffing. Sometimes they're performing sponsor duties under the regulations. Other times they're contracted to perform investigative responsibilities, such as capturing patient case history data, which can be a concern if the investigator is not a party to the agreement with the vendor. So it's important that each contract be reviewed and assessed for potential risk of losing control and access and oversight of the data. So with each additional delegation, if you contract with a subcontractor and they have the ability to hire many other subcontractors, with each additional iteration or each additional delegation on that, then there is a risk of losing control and access and oversight. So it's important to keep that in mind and run those questions through as you're setting up agreements. So when you're selecting a vendor, you'll want to look at their qualifications, not just their reputation, but what training and experience do they have to perform the tasks that you're laying out for them on this particular study. How are you going to verify their compliance with the contract and assure that they're meeting your intention for data collection, protection, and retention? Do you have adequate permissions and authority to do so? And will the contractor maintain control, and will you be involved in that to protect that chain of oversight throughout the execution of the study protocol? And I would say that the degree of control that's necessary is going to depend on the nature of the task that's being performed. And I keep going back to access. There are limits to access to data and or are there limits to access to data and personnel who can review data? If the monitor needs to be able to verify data points and they'll have to go through a contractor, that's something that needs to be considered ahead of time. Same thing with a regulator. If the regulator is going to need access to the data points, that needs to be considered when setting up those agreements with third-party vendors. Next, in kind of keeping with our theme of electronic and digital data, we are seeing increased interest in electronic systems for consent and remote consent discussions. So we're talking about electronic means to educate study participants and obtain documentation of informed consent. So we're talking about more than applying a digital signature. There's some real opportunities here to increase comprehension through videos, through graphs, through diagrams, through interactive assessments of their understanding of the information. But it's important to remember e-consent or paper consent, the information provided to the subjects needs to be understandable. And so in this format, it needs to be user-friendly. There should be a method to identify subjects if you're talking about some kind of remote consent discussions or remote consent exchanges. You need to be able to adequately and accurately identify the subjects and to protect their privacy. Study subjects need the opportunity to ask questions and hold a discussion. So it can't just be watch this video. They need to have a real opportunity to follow up on questions that they have as they go through the data. This could be a useful tool for changes in research, but it, again, needs to provide the study subject with opportunities to ask questions and to refuse to continue on the trial or withdraw their participation in the study. So important things to remember on informed consent. Last topic I'd like to bring up under inspectional trends is the changing design of study protocols. They can take many forms and they're called by many names. We've seen adaptive clinical trials, pragmatic protocols, master study protocols. The challenges are similar. It's how are you going to maintain control and compliance with the investigational plan? Some of these new approaches to protocols are complex designs. They may have multiple amendments, which also require multiple consent changes. The potential for errors and deviations from the plan are high. I mean, it can be more resource intensive. So if we go back to that idea of HACCP and analyzing our hazards, where are the complexities in the given study protocol, and how are those going to be controlled? Is it through site training? Is it through periodic reassessments of staffing, including observations, to make sure that the staffing remains adequate when new tasks are added or when there are frequent changes and there are more decision points in the execution of the trial? Again, direct observation may be important to make sure that the study staff is able to execute accurately the latest versions of the compliance of the study protocol. And quality control checks of key tasks or data may be important. So each situation is different, and they may not necessarily require additional oversight. But the more complex the protocol, I think the more imperative it is on research sites to do a real assessment as to how the resources will need to be planned and monitored throughout the course of the study. And in closing, I just want to mention some of the latest guidance that is out there for clinical research industry. So we've got some recent guidance on COVID-19 and its impact on clinical research. The adjustments we've made in our approaches to regulatory oversight, some suggestions for industry. Also, I included on this list the International Conference for Harmonization document on GCPs, which is a great comprehensive guidance on regulatory expectations for clinical research. So encourage that as a great starting point if you're looking for guidance. Some of the tech changes have been addressed, and much of the slides that I've discussed in here, these topics can be followed up in these digital health technologies for remote data acquisition, electronic informed consent, adaptive clinical trials. A lot of great new information, new approaches to getting innovative medical products to consumers. So encourage you to start at that FDA.gov GCP webpage and click on the guidance, clinical research guidance, to get more information on agency expectations. And I'll just close by opening it up to questions. Thank you.